Executive Director of the Jewish Film Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival. This is our 38th year, and I'm very pleased to present a panel for you today called Hands On, Hands Off, The Anatomy of a Feminist Film Movement. This panel is sponsored by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and we're very honored today to have some esteemed filmmakers and activists to talk about the issues presented in the films. So I'd like to welcome them to the stage. First, we have Nancy Schwartzman, who's the director of Roll, Red, Roll, the film that we just saw. Thank you, Nancy. And Cynthia Lowen, who is the director of Netizens, a film that we exhibited yesterday. Anita Sarkeesian, an award-winning media critic and also activist. And Ron Barney from Coaching Boys to Men, a program of Futures Without Violence. Welcome to the Castro stage, everybody.
Thank you.
So I thought we would start out by really talking about the moment that we're living in right now and the role of media in creating solutions to some of the problems that we're seeing in our society. And we've had two amazing films, Netizens and Roll, Red, Roll. And I'm struck by the fact that both of you began production on these films long before the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement have become such a focal point of our national discussion. And I thought it would be great to kind of start out by asking you to talk a little bit about the work that you had both been doing prior to making these films, and what catalyzed your decision to focus on these important stories at this time? And maybe we'll start with you, Nancy, and then go to Cynthia.
I was going to deflect to Cynthia. I was like, we should start with you. I will say maybe what I've just said during the Q&A, but I've spent the past 10, 15 years in the space of gender-based violence, investigating consent through nonfiction filmmaking, investigating how technology impacts intimacy through filmmaking, and then also how we can prevent violence using code and developing a mobile app. So I've been in that space, but I think the intersection around technology and how it's like shaping our activism and our relationships was as weighted and equal as my passion for looking at gender-based violence and ways we can prevent it. So I was sort of on that path for quite some time, and what attracted me to the Steubenville story was the social media aspect of it, the new technology, and also just it was an opportunity to really look at and investigate perpetration and bystanders. And for so long, in my opinion, I feel like the lens is always on victims and survivors to carry the burden of, bringing our stories to you so that hopefully you'll care, or like trying to create empathy. And I'm done with that. What I want to do is sort of pass the baton to those who can help transform the culture and who are long overlooked as part of the issue that need to be part of the solution. And that to me is men and boys.
So in, I think it was 2012, a film that I had co-produced and wrote. Can you hear me now? Great. Yes? All right. So in 2012, I had a film that I co-produced and wrote called Bully, which is a documentary about 5 kids and families in a year in the life of bullying in America, came out, ironically enough, with the Weinstein Company. And when we were in the process of making the film, and then in the process of getting the film into communities, there was something that we had heard over and over and over again, which is, bullying is human nature. I don't know why you're even bothering to make this film. Kids will be kids, boys will be boys. Bullying is a rite of passage. It's a really normal part of adolescence, and good luck changing culture and all that. And when we released the film, and we did a tremendous amount of work in schools, in communities, with young people, with parents, with educators. What we found is that actually stories can transform culture, and they can shift our attitudes, and they can make us think differently and see things differently and illuminate things that we perhaps have seen happening all around us for years, and in the case of bullying, decades, and for as long as anyone can think back to their experiences as a young person. We can change these things. We can change our expectations of what is normal. And we had a lot of success in that, with that film. When I had finished the film and was starting to look at next projects, and of course, in speaking with schools and communities, what was happening online was just such a huge dimension of the violence that people were experiencing in their communities, and in particular, what women are experiencing. And some of the things that I was hearing about those acts of violence and that abuse, this digital abuse, were things that I'd heard about bullying too. Oh, it's normal, it's just a normal part of the internet. If you get online, that's what you expect. That's the price of being a woman online with an opinion. Or just a woman being in the world. And so I thought, we all see this happening around us. We all witness these things online and in our digital spaces and in our digital communities, and I thought that if I could show this through the lens of film, that there was an opportunity to start to think a little differently about what we accept as normal in these spaces. So that's where that came from.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that really strikes me, I have a 12-year-old daughter who's in middle school, and, the images in pop culture that she's exposed to being a vocal student, meaning vocal performance in music culture and performance culture are surprising to me, but also surprising to me is her critical thinking about media that she seems to be getting within her peer group here in the Bay Area. And you have a subject in your film, Anita Sarkeesian, who's here joining us, and you're the executive director of Feminist Frequency. And I think you're really looking at pop culture and really breaking down, what do these images mean. I was wondering if you could talk to the issue of what young people in high school and middle school are being exposed to, and what are the efforts being made to kind of communicate about, how these images can be interpreted, and also how they can model their own, self-image based on positive images.
Sure. So we don't work directly with high school and middle school, so I can't speak to that explicitly, but I can speak to the larger landscape of media. And I think that there are, let me back up. When I started doing Feminist Frequency, it was 2009, and it's really remarkable to see the change in the media landscape over the last 10 years, how we see so many more representations of different people and different bodies than we ever did before. But that doesn't mean that we don't still have a lot of the same harmful stereotypes that that are from the past as well. So the series that we did about video games specifically looked at the way women are represented in video games and in gaming culture, and it became this massive, huge project, bigger than I could have ever imagined, because it was so bad. We're like, oh, as soon as you uncover one horribly sexist example, there's like 20 more that follow it. And so I think that it's interesting how you're talking about your daughter is exposed to these images, right? These like highly sexualized images, what it means, like there's still very much even though we're getting more representations, it is still a very specific notion of what femininity is, what female empowerment looks like, which is a very specific and often very sexualized. It's self-sexualizing in a lot of ways. But we are getting more and more voices out there that are critiquing that in a mainstream way. And so it's a really interesting time that, as a feminist media critic, I sort of struggle with how to make sense of what's happening right now because of all of these different dimensions and the complexity of living in a space that is transforming in front of us, but also still holding on to a regressive status quo in terms of harmful, sexist, racist, ableist narratives.
Right, and I mean, although you don't work directly with those populations, you really have a following. I mean, in Cynthia's film, we see that group of girls come up to you and want to take selfies with you in Dolores Park. And, you know, I think because that generation of middle schoolers and high schoolers are online, they're actually finding your podcasts and your videos, as well as other really feminist young women who are speaking their voice. So I think, you know, you're right, there's a mix of images online and a mix of representations online, and they're having to navigate, you know, those choices.
And to be super obnoxious, I'm going to just plug the fact that I did just write a YA book, which I forgot when you asked me that question. It's a book for teens about women who've been written out of history, and I have some postcards, so afterwards, if you want more information, come and grab them and give them to all of your young people in your life.
And definitely check out the videos and podcasts on Anita's website, and if you have teens, it's great to watch together. So, Ron, I want to talk to you because I'm so happy that you're here. Nancy kind of said to me, you know, if you're going to have a panel, you really need to have like the masculine perspective represented. And her film is so powerful and really shows the way in which athletics has contributed to a culture of rape culture. And I think the other side of athletics is another kind of sort of tendency to collaborate and work as a team. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to, first of all, the program, Coaching Boys to Men, and tell us a little bit about what your work is, but also why you've chosen to sort of focus that within the context of athletics and how you're using both sides, sort of the negative, you know, kind of nationalistic sports, you know, patriotism, right, and then the team building aspect to address some of these issues with young men.
Okay, well, I coached for 38 years, and I'm still doing some coaching now, so like I say, on my 40th when it comes to actual coaching. But athletics is the backbone of most of our schools, first of all. And one of my goals in life was to help young men become good men and people that could be of use in society to make the society better. And I've always done that for years without realizing what I was doing, without any tools other than common sense. So Coaching Boys into Men came about, and we were on the ground floor, and it came out of between Pittsburgh and San Francisco, and we were the guinea pig. My school was the guinea pig. I chose to do it. And basically what it is, it's lessons, first of all. And through athletics, a coach is with their players for a minimum of 2 to 3 hours a day, sometimes year-round, so you have quite a bit of influence. And I've probably am the dad to about thousands of young men through all the years I've been involved. And so by teaching them morals and values and leadership and all those kind of things that I was doing before, Coaching Boys into Men gave me a better access to do a better job. And so at the particular school I was at, I'll have to share this with you because this is an amazing thing, but we started doing there's 10 lessons. We started doing the lessons one a week after football practice, and we go into a room and we do the lessons. Well, the lessons start out, number one is just respect. Simple lesson. It doesn't really affect it's easy to talk about. So we talked about it, and we built up the lessons until some of the harder lessons, like an example, consent. What's consent? That's a lesson. Boy, that's a great lesson. Another one of my favorite ones, which we're discussing here, digital disrespect. I could spend days on that. Okay, as you get going, the young men open up. Now, the other thing I've noticed, young men at the high school level, and the middle school level also, which we've dabbed in, they can change, and they can understand through education on how to be better people. It also empowers them, it empowers their leadership. So what I found is I had 100 football players in a meeting of a school of about 1,100 students. After the first 2 or 3 lessons, the word was out amongst the campus on what we were doing, amongst the females and the males. Many of my girls would come up and ask me questions about the lesson. And of course, I shared it with them. And then I noticed the best part of all was the culture of our campus completely changed. The bad language stopped. We were picking up garbage. I saw young men actually holding doors open for our young ladies. And I saw respect back and forth and good words being used. Very, very powerful. Okay, from there, I did my work at my school. I also worked for the state of Alaska, where I've pretty much trained everybody that's a coach up there, or an athletic director. And here's the best part of that news. When I first went up there, the statistics were terrible. Violence against women, rape, all that stuff led the nation. And this was about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. I just got an email from one of the gals I work with, and she goes, Ron, I got some good news. We got stats, and boy, the stats are changing. So we've been able to change some of those stats. And they directly think it was because of the program, because we started at the bottom with our young people and worked our way up. Okay, the other thing that I've noticed, and I know it was mentioned, our society doesn't talk about a lot of things. We're afraid to talk about things, and that's the hardest part. I know in the schools, when I go to schools and talk to superintendents, different people like that, sometimes they're iffy, kind of like in the film that Nancy did. You can kind of sense that. They kind of want to avoid it, they want to be careful, they want to protect. Well, if they really want to do that, they have to open up. You have to open up that conversation, which we are now, between social media, the good part of social media, and things like we're doing today. If we open a dialogue, we can change this. And I've seen the changes, so I know. I'm on the ground floor. I'm the grunt in the foxhole. And I promise you that I'm going to do everything I can do, and I am doing. And with these kinds of things, and with the films that we have, I haven't seen the bullying film, but I'm going to watch it because that's another part of the whole deal. But these films are going to make a big difference. They're going to give us tools to work with, and I think our young people need to see it as much as our adults and our educators. Thank you.
Thank you. So, speaking of the films, I think both of you have kind of thought about pretty extensive outreach campaigns and impact campaigns around these films. So how will they be used in the world now that now that they've premiered at Tribeca and they're making their way around in theaters? How will you use them to make a difference?
I can start. Impact and impact campaigns are a very kind of buzzy term in our very niche documentary world. Social change documentaries. I think what's really exciting in general, my film, and I notice we share some executive producers, my film was funded entirely by women, which is amazing. I have 9 executive producers, all of them women, which is incredible, and also an opportunity to invite male investors and male funders to support our projects. But what's being clear is that you can't get a film like ours that's intense content or feminist content or social change out into the world without a robust campaign. The media landscape is so competitive, and it's also, there are powers that be that do not want this content out there also, right? And that's real. So what's exciting and what I love about our community of documentary is that there are pathways to bolster the release and distribution of these kinds of films. some of how that's done is through an impact campaign. So my goal in crafting this film and what I want to focus on, as Ron and I have been talking about, is really to engage men and boys through robust community screenings and education. I'm working with some folks in the NCAA. I'm trying to get in various doors at the NFL. I have one door open. We need to open 5 more. I have a coach and a player at the New York Giants. So I want to hit a bunch of pro athletes, because part of it is changing the concept around who's the hot, cool athlete. Well, that's the person who's brave enough to speak out against gender-based violence. I'm ready for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to interrupt, but I mean, that really speaks directly to the scene in your film that was so disturbing, where you hear the young men talking about emulating Mike Tyson and other luminaries who have now been, prosecuted for sexual violence crimes. So I think the role model route is a very, very important route.
We have to do it.
And so what kind of a response are you getting on that end?
A lot of excitement from those who are ready, and I think it is going to be like a domino effect. I also serve on Vice President Biden, not the other one, Vice President Biden's foundation, Council on Violence Against Women, and there's a player, William Gay, who's just started with the Giants, who was with the Steelers, who's on every call saying, if you guys need me, I'm here. My mother was murdered by my stepfather. I'm here to advocate against domestic violence. I will be public, right? And so what I really hope we can do is ignite more men, because a lot of them care, they really do, to say, step forward. And Biden did this It's On Us campaign, and that was about 4 years ago, and it was very public, but it was a little too, it was sort of, it's on all of us. And now it seems like they're focusing pretty specifically on it's on men and boys to actually transform this culture. So we're inviting, we want to create a space and a platform to model a different kind of standing up and activism in the space of gender. And this is my little plug, that we are looking for support and venues in the Bay Area and organizations and funding to launch an Upstander Tour campaign across the country and be able to bring this film out to all of those schools and teams and associations that should see it.
And how about Netison's impact campaign? What are the plans?
So for those of you who may not have seen the film, it's a feature documentary about women and online harassment. And, it's one of those things that is, in a way, it's like such an enormous issue. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh, well, we all get online. I don't want to speak for everybody here, but I would say most of us get online every day. We interact with online communities every day. We're using our digital devices. It's like a massive issue, and at the same time, it's something that we're all really totally connected to on an individual level. So my hope with this film was that it can be a real tool for people who are getting online every day, as many of us do, in terms of how do we see our digital communities? What are our expectations for those communities? What are the expectations for the websites to uphold and enforce and create constructive community standards? And what are our expectations for law enforcement, policymakers, and kind of the big systems at play that dictate to such a large degree what are our experiences in these online spaces. So I think on an individual level, it's like we all can be part of holding the structures accountable to have constructive spaces and to protect us as we are interacting with each other and the world in these places. That said, this is something that I want policymakers to be using. I want educators to be using. I want universities to be using. I want women and girls to be using. Law enforcement and criminal justice. So my hope is that, and we're in the process right now of launching our campaign and partnering with a really diverse group of advocates and organizations and companies and individuals to use this film as a tool. What is the kind of change that you are in a position to enact, and how can this film be a part of it, is really kind of the question asking to the people that we're partnering with right now. And my hope is that through working with a really diverse range of people, from law enforcement to domestic violence advocates to university educators, that we can really have a positive, good, strong impact.
I was really struck in your film by just the bravery of the women subjects that you've got going on. Anita's one of them, but we also see Carrie Goldberg, this wonderful Jewish attorney in New York City, who's really breaking new ground in terms of fighting some of these online assault, harassment, and cyber revenge porn cases. And it's interesting to me, the kind of the butting up between, you know, free speech and the First Amendment and the right to privacy and to not be violated or harassed online. So it's a very interesting area, I think, of the law, but we're seeing implications of that kind of clash in other areas of our culture. And I'm wondering if actually, Cynthia, you and Anita might comment a little bit on this, because, you know, I've gotten a little bit of a taste of it as a public figure, but when you post online, you're also risking the blowback that you're going to get and the harassment that you might get just from making this issue public. And I think your subjects face that as well. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how people, you know, negotiate that territory, and what strides are we making, you know, in the legal world to kind of make the space safer for people that are calling attention to the issues. Long question, but maybe break it up by bits.
I guess I'll start with a bit, because this question is like a major hornet's nest. Like, it's like we could probably go on for like 3 days about this, the complexities that are brought out by this question. But I'll start by saying that I think what's happening to a great degree is that the notion of free speech is being misappropriated by people who are using speech to abuse, terrorize, silence, and not allow people to participate effectively in our democracy and in our online spaces where expression is really important. So the conversation that is being had in many different ways, on many different levels throughout the country, is what is the relationship between one person's free speech, which may be used to abuse and terrorize and disenfranchise someone, and someone else's civil rights. And that's a really complicated question, and I think it's playing out in a lot of different ways right now. But I think that that's the misappropriation is a big part of what we're seeing. Something else I will say is that there was just an article in the New York Times last week, I think Thursday or Friday, about how a lot of tech companies and social media platforms have long had a very absolutist stance on free speech, and have been very, have not really wanted to engage in the dialogue about, you know, when is speech actually a weapon depriving someone of their civil rights. That is changing, and so I would encourage people to look for this article, because I think it's interesting. But the thing that is underlying that is the fact that websites, thanks to a law called Section 230 of the Internet Decency Act, is that what it's called? Privacy and Decency? Section 230, yeah. So these social networking platforms and internet websites have immunity from liability. They enjoy total immunity from liability if someone is...
Just meaning they can't get sued for the content on their platforms.
Yeah, and so it has, I think, really fostered a very hands-off approach, because they don't really feel vulnerable in a lot of ways to the ramifications for abuse that is suffered by people on their platforms, and how that abuse may be depriving them of their safety, their freedom, their expression, or their employment. So it's a pretty big issue. I'll hand it over to you if you have anything else to add.
I feel like the issue of online harassment needs to be, there's three arenas that we need to focus on. One is social media platforms, one is legal, and one is cultural change. And I wish Carrie was here to speak to the legal aspect, because there's so many amazing people who are featured in this documentary and others who are doing really great work in terms of navigating the laws around online harassment. For example, like, there are things like, if you threaten someone, that is illegal. Whether it's online or not shouldn't make a difference. But in actuality, the way that that plays out, if you go to a local law enforcement or you try to prosecute, it's not that clean. It's not that clear. So, and things like non-consensual pornography or revenge porn, as it's commonly known, like, there's been people who've done great work to enact laws in many states now around this issue, which is a unique issue to the web, right, to internet culture. Same thing with swatting, and so there are things being done, but a massive amount of work still needs to be done from a legislative point of view in terms of, like, educating law enforcement. The number of stories, both that I've experienced and that I've heard of, where people go to their local law enforcement and say, I'm being threatened online, and they're like, yeah, well, what? I don't know what Twitter is. What's Twitter? Right? And you're like, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable, the way that people get treated. And also, you know, this gets into a larger issue of that there are particular communities that would never go to law enforcement no matter what, because it is more dangerous to go to law enforcement because they are targeted by the police. For me, I've spent a lot of my time focusing on the other two aspects, the cultural change and social media. With social media, I think that there is it provides us an opportunity to talk about a much broader range of online harassment that I think often gets erased in these narratives, because the bomb threats and the death threats and the rape threats are the big sensational headlines. They're the ones that get you on talk shows, they're the ones that get you on the front page of the New York Times, but the day-to-day grind of online harassment that isn't illegal by the definition of the law is the stuff that is absolutely exhausting and debilitating and contributes to a large amount of trauma that we face by being targets of online harassment. So being told that you're a liar, being told that, you know, wild conspiracy theories about you being concocted and repeated to you over and over and over again, not being able to say anything online without, like, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of mostly men responding to that very aggressively and angrily should not be illegal by the definition of the law, but it should potentially not be not acceptable on the platforms. So platforms are private companies. They can determine what their terms of service are. They get to determine the rules of their own platforms, which goes back to this issue of, like, when they say that they are for freedom of speech, well, what does that mean? And what does that actually look like? And what are they doing to provide safety on their platforms for their users? And here's the thing is, right now, we are in a time when social media companies recognize that there's a problem, which they did not recognize 5 or 6 years ago when I started doing this work. And they are doing, to various degrees, work to try to deal with this problem. But it often feels like a Band-Aid being piled on top of, like, a gushing geyser, because these platforms were built from the ground up by white dudes who never ever thought about harm or safety on their platforms. So from a fundamental level, they are flawed. And the question is, can they be repaired? Will the new platforms that come out next year or the year after that have mass appeal, are those going to take into consideration online harassment and protect us as their users from the ground up? Putting pressure on social media companies can help transform the way that we communicate online and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
Oh, can I just say something quickly?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, swatting is when a prank caller will call the police and give the address of a person, often who is live streaming a video game or some other sort of thing, and say that either a murder or some vicious, horrible crime is happening, and then the police send a SWAT team to that house and usually break in, and it has now resulted in a death, the police killing an innocent person because of that. But this happens regularly, and it's increasingly happening and incredibly traumatic.
I just wanted to say something, because actually, Anita, you and I met at a Twitter Trust and Safety Council, where Twitter flew in a bunch of activists to talk about this, and it was like really early. And while I appreciate the work, it also, everyone in the room was kind of looking at each other like, are you kidding? Like, you want to make your terms of service font bigger. Like, is that the, or terms of usage solution? I just wanted to say, from a Jewish perspective, making the Steubenville film, my character Alex was harassed quite a bit, and really sort of personally put through a lot for her being vocal online and going up against online bullying and harassment. So I got very careful when I was making this film and had to go pretty dark on social media, which felt really terrible and really silencing, and I couldn't be myself, and the election was coming up, and I was like, this is really a complicated avenue as filmmakers trying to expose a situation as a woman. I did finally get targeted at one point, and it was because I was Jewish. So out of nowhere, one weekend over the summer, a pile-on of neo-Nazis came after me. Because I think I critiqued a white person or something, and I critiqued whiteness, and then I was outed as not really white, and I was like, you guys, it's not rocket science, my last name is Schwartzman. Yes, I'm Jewish. So it's just interesting how this plays out in terms of where harassment comes and what part of your identity is going to be targeted. Is it because I'm a survivor, or a filmmaker, or a feminist, or a Jew? It's like no part of you is safe.
And the thing is that you don't have to be Jewish to receive an enormous amount of anti-Semitism. Like, I'm telling you, anyone who is has white privilege and is attacked online is attacked for being Jewish. Like, the amount of those horrifically racist cartoon drawings, like the sort of bullshit.
Peppy.
Yeah, it was actually very eye-opening to me a decade ago to see how deep the anti-Semitism runs in online harassment and in life, but also specifically.
Yeah, and I thought I'd follow up on that a little bit with you, Anita, because you talk about intersectionality on your website, and I think this is a term that a lot of young people are super familiar with, but maybe older generations are just kind of learning about. And I think what's really interesting to me is, we had somebody from the ADL here the other day talking about, the connections between the white supremacist groups and also misogyny as an issue. So I think we're kind of understanding the ways in which these kinds of harassments are connected. And we reached out to a lot of organizations in prep for this day that were about Black Girls Who Code, and a couple of other organizations that are being led by women of color who are really dealing with this issue. But I know you talk about intersectionality on your website. Can you maybe explain to people that haven't learned about this, what are some of the issues there and how they intersect?
Yeah, so intersectionality was coined by a feminist scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, and the idea is that there are different sites of privilege and oppression, and that those often intersect, which is where intersectionality comes from. So if you are a white man who is also gay, you might be oppressed for being gay, but you have privilege being a white and male. If you are a Black woman, you are oppressed by your race and by your gender, and so that obviously can grow depending on many different intersections, so class, ability, size, physical appearance, gender expression, etc. And so the way that manifests both offline and online is that if you are a Black woman being targeted by online harassment, you're going to get sexist and racist comments versus just a white woman who might just get sexist comments, right? We're talking about a pylon of shit, right? And it's just a matter of how big the pile is, and the creative ways that they will come after you for these specific identity markers. And yeah, so that's kind of how it relates to this conversation.
Yeah, so Ron, kind of coming back to you, listening to this conversation and also having seen the film, Nancy's film, for the second time, you know, you're dealing with, on a very grassroots level, with people that, you know, may not have confronted these issues personally. What do you think are the most successful ways to approach somebody in terms of communication tools and techniques so that the response isn't defensiveness, but rather an ability to stand in another person's shoes and to have compassion and understand? Because I think you're really dealing with a lot of people on a one-on-one level or in small groups. So how do you kind of deal on that very kind of grassroots ground level?
Right. Well, in coaching, you coach everybody, and that's what's really neat about it. Because I know, again, at my school, that particular school I was at, my son, who's now 28, he said something to me one day. It was really interesting. He goes, "Dad, I love my school." He goes, "We got people from different religions, different races, and we're all buddies. We're all friends. We all respect each other." Well, how does that start? Well, it starts again with the adults in the room. First of all, you have to show respect and responsibility. You have to have discussions with your teams, with your players, and all the people around you about these things. And then they start talking, that which is the best part. Because once they leave you, they get out there and they have those discussions. So this particular school that I worked at is a real interesting place because everybody gets along pretty well. There's very few fights and this and that. And I think, again, it's education, it's having conversations, and it's about respecting each other from the get-go, starting with the adults, and then talking about it with the students, and then it just blossoms. And it's a lot of work, obviously, but it doesn't happen in a lot of places. That's the sad part.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this idea of adults modeling, because you could see the negative example in Nancy's film. I was really shocked by the language that the coach was using, even in the police interview, you know, where you would think that self-censorship, or, you know, that you would have the ability to edit yourself to sound like you're at least okay.
I was greatly disappointed in that, from a coaching standpoint, a human being standpoint, because the people that I work with, the way I operate, I would never operate that way or work with people like that, or allow them to be around my students. Again, that's the work that has to be done, and it's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would bring it back to this idea of adults modeling, that we're living in a time where, you know, the highest office in the land is modeling, you know, language and behavior on social media that we're talking about not condoning. And I don't think that, you know, when the internet kind of first appeared, I don't think people could actually imagine, you know, all the ways in which this would manifest itself. So one of the audience members on my way up here said, you know, she feels like the responses are kind of behind because things are moving at such an exponential pace in terms of the number of platforms and, you know, the news that comes out every day. So I wanted you all to maybe share positive examples of things that you're seeing in media and online that are powerful and empowering and that model diversity and the world that we want to live in. Something that you can point to and direct other people to look at that, you know, feels like, okay, this is something that's really moving in the right direction about how these tools can be used to the positive.
So I said earlier that we are seeing a bit of a changing landscape in the media, and I don't quite know if it's here to stay. I don't know quite how to interpret it yet. But I've been really taken with the director Ava DuVernay, who has, she did Wrinkle in Time, she did a documentary called 13th, she has a show called Queen Sugar. This woman is just a powerhouse. I don't know how, she probably doesn't sleep. But as a black woman and as a black woman filmmaker who came into this industry sort of later in life, she has really stepped up in terms of opening the door for everyone behind her, which I don't think we don't see often enough. And so, for example, she has this show called Queen Sugar, which I adore. And this last season, season 3, was directed by all female filmmakers. And some who have never directed TV before. So she's giving people opportunities. She's really trying to rise up and support female filmmakers, specifically women of color. And that is, I think, going to help transform the media landscape in terms of whose stories are being told and who's getting opportunities to tell those stories.
Yeah, Cheryl Dunier, who's a local filmmaker, directed one of those episodes, and I think the whole filmmaking community was like cheering her on. It's really revolutionary. Yeah, there was a film at Sundance that really looked at the role of women in documentary film and kind of looking at the issue of parody and how do you get to a place where you're actually telling the stories and therefore enabling people to see the world through maybe a different lens. So I want to ask about that a little bit because I feel that one of the directors was actually, it might have been Ava DuVernay, was talking about seeing resumes for cinematographers and realizing that the women applying for those positions didn't have as sophisticated a cinematography reel as some of the men that were applying and weren't working on the big budget films that would allow you to have a reel that would be of the quality that you would need to direct, to shoot a big series. So it's sort of a chicken and egg, who gives the first opportunity, and then, you have the reaction by, other people to quota systems or to favoring underrepresented minorities in these positions above other people who are quote unquote more qualified. So I guess, the three of you are in the media world and the tech world, and you're navigating these territories. So what can you say about, how it is negotiating that landscape, and what remedy do you think there is so that we ensure that a diversity of voices get heard?
One thing I'll add in regards to kind of who's behind the camera, for netizens, I wanted to make a film that wasn't just about women, but I also very much wanted to have, to every extent possible, to work with women. So we had all women cinematographers, women producers, all of our executive producers were women, composers, graphics designers, sort of our whole creative team were women. And for some of them, it was kind of the first bigger feature that they had worked on. And I think, again, it is really important to, we all are like in it together, and kind of all being part of these projects is really meaningful to our careers and advancing and bringing more and more women into filmmaking and into storytelling. Something that was so interesting, though, was that we got to a process in post-production where we got to doing our final sound mix and our final color correct, and I was working with a very, major company in New York, two very big companies, and when I got there, I think there was one woman, there was one colorist, she wasn't available, but there was one colorist who was a woman at the facility. And on the sound mixing side, I don't think they had any women working there as sound mixers. So eventually we kind of hit that. It was very clear when we hit the utter total gender disparity wall, because there were no women to work with once we got to a certain point. And it was really revealing. In terms of that question of how do you build your resume if you're not getting hired, if these women aren't being employed in these very major post-production facilities, where do you get an opportunity? And that's a huge issue.
We had a different, I love productions that are all women, and I'm very jealous of all the people that get to work with women cinematographers. I absolutely, in the field, could not bring women because it was weird enough that I was a female director that people had to listen to. And so I really chose my crew, certainly in the field, really carefully, unfortunately, so that no one, I mean, I've tried to pretend like my male producer was in charge, but like, you know, everyone was like, well, you're the lady, you're in charge, right? But I just couldn't. I like literally couldn't. It was weird enough in that area, which is, you know, only an hour from Pittsburgh, but also, you know, across the river from West Virginia. There were no women in leadership anywhere. There were no women clergy. I would go to city council meetings. There were no women on city council. There were certainly no women in coaching positions. There just were not women in leadership. So me having to go up to coach, me having to go up to people to try to get them to talk, if I didn't have white men by me, there would have been no way. I mean, so it was like this weird, you know, I had to explain that to my funders, like, why do you have all these white men? I was like, okay, here's why. You know, it was pretty shocking, actually, the ways in which you are not taken seriously as a woman, which can also sometimes be an advantage when you're doing investigative work. But I wanted to just point out on the positive front of things that have changed. When I made The Line, my first film, looking at the line of consent, I went around to like 65 colleges, and it's in 2,000 college libraries, but I did a lot of public speaking. And at these events, you know, every once in a while, there'd be this amazing young man who would come up to me, and he's like fired up, and he's like, I created the, you know, Men Against Violence Club at my school in Syracuse. And and these really like bright, excited guys, and I'm like, oh, you're amazing, and I'm so glad you're here. What are you doing when you graduate? Is there a place for you to go after? Are you just gonna kind of get lost and get diffused? Like in the women's movement, there's tons of organizations and online and communities, and I would see these really awesome guys, and then I would never hear from them again. They'd have nowhere to go. There wasn't built-in mentorship. There wasn't a kind of established movement of men trying to mentor and engage young men in violence prevention and the dismantling of sexism. Things have really changed, so that's positive. So here I am now, we're working on a pilot program with graduates of Men Can Stop Rape, and all of a sudden there are these now websites that are challenging men to bring each other into the movement. Like there's just a lot more places to find, It's on Us, which Biden, the Biden Foundation started, is really mentoring and bringing them up from college level and not abandoning them when they're 22. So the movement is growing, it's getting more organized, there's more infrastructure to support that kind of change making. So I would say that feels different and really positive for the work that we're trying to do.
Anita, what about in tech and video gaming? Are you seeing changes between 2009 and now in those realms?
Yes, absolutely. It is kind of like one step forward, two steps back. And so as activists, I think it's important that we celebrate the wins, because it's easy to just think everything is terrible all the time, because it feels that way. And sometimes it is. But I have seen a very clear difference in the games industry and the games press from when I started my video series, which was 6 years ago, to now, where while, yes, there is still sexism in the games industry, absolutely. We're seeing more conversations about it. We're seeing, we have seen over the years more press asking questions about representation when they never did before. But that's not to say everything is all happy-go-lucky, right? So there's a big controversy that happened recently where a female game developer got fired because she told one of their fans to stop mansplaining to her. So like, they started a huge campaign and they won and she got fired. So like, these issues are still with us, even if there are moments where it's feeling better, right? Where the overt sexism that I'm seeing, that I saw in games regularly with like every game release, is not as common as it was. So it's one of those, it's a complicated question and a complicated answer. I don't think online harassment has changed. I think it's gotten worse. I think that you can draw a direct line from the folks who are targeting people in games directly to the election of Trump. And so like, that's not getting better, but social media companies are talking about these issues in ways that they weren't, and they are doing some work to try to deal with it. And the companies that you probably think are doing the worst job are actually doing a better job, and vice versa. But so it's a very complicated question in terms of, like, yes, there are some improvements. We need to fight for more. We need to constantly demand better everything, better representations in the media, better policies and procedures on our social media platforms, and keep doing this activist work to get them to listen, because they wouldn't do anything if it wasn't for us creating an uproar about it. And that's what these films do, and that's what all of these activists do to try to create a better world.
So on that note, I'd love to close with a question around the name of our panel. We named it Hands On, Hands Off, the anatomy of a feminist film movement. And I think we were thinking of the, plethora of media that's come out in recent years: Audrey and Daisy, Jennifer Fox's film The Tale, your films. There have been a lot of films, Kirby Dick's film, films about, sexual harassment in the military. We're seeing more stories coming forward, and we're feeling like there's more of a kind of community of filmmakers that are really committing themselves to bringing these issues to light. And now, you started these film projects many years ago, but now there's a new conversation within the past year, or a new level of an older conversation within the past year. Are you seeing a feminist film movement? And if not, what can we do to make that happen? You've been on the festival circuit, so you've been sort of seeing the response to your work and the film community. So share with us what you're seeing.
I think one thing that I feel is really important is that, films by and about women are not just for women. And we want these films to be, championed and engaged with, we want to talk to men. We want men in the room. We want this to be, not just sort of put in like the women's category of the film festival. And so I think that while we're seeing a lot more films by and about women and that are really championing women's voices and women's stories, I think there does remain to be a tendency to kind of put them in like the women film corner, and that those films are sort of, marketed to women, the events are kind of marketed to women, and that often what we see in the audience, and I can't see many of you, but I can't see because of the lights, but I wanted to thank all the men who are here today for coming out and being part of this, and your participation is key, critical. So I think that that's the challenge, is like, these are not just films for women, these are films for all of us.
Yeah, so you're speaking to the preaching to the converted versus, really getting the message out there to a wide range of the general public.
And also the siloing.
Yeah.
It's not just that, because, I think all of us have things to learn about dismantling patriarchy and sexism. But, luckily, I would say Tribeca, in terms of our premiere, it was almost 50-50 gender parity in terms of the film lineup at Tribeca Film Festival this year. They had an incredibly strong doc lineup, and I didn't feel siloed at all. And I do feel like in our industry, there are so many women filmmakers, which is pretty kick-ass. Yeah, but completely agree with you in terms of I've been asked to do a lot of panels around Me Too and the film movement, and how can we transform the industry? And at Hot Docs, it was like all women at the panel, and I was like, I don't even feel like having this conversation. How to avoid harassment, ladies? Like, it's just, that's not what we need. But in terms of the feminist film movement, we're in San Francisco, where I feel like the roots of feminism and filmmaking and DIY filmmaking are so strong, and I feel lucky that we're able to contribute to this conversation that's only been building and building and building, and that audiences are ready for it. Our investors understand, like, okay, we got the film this far, now we have to like help you get it further, and I think there's a really strong infrastructure to keep this going. In terms of supporting women artists, but just totally echoing what Cynthia said. These stories and experiences are for all of us, and they're not to be siloed in the women's section.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you.
Thank you all.
And thank you all so much for coming.